Now, after releasing the first part of the range DPS videos, now we're going to be making one for melee. This is the same. We're going to judge and rate the melee DPS for how enjoyable they are, how fun, entertaining, refreshing they are to play. And we're going to base this metric on two things. One is the gameplay loop. In short, as a quick recap from the range DPS video, if you haven't seen it yet, because you will see it right now. Actually, no, after this video, you will see it. The gameplay loop is how do you go from point 1 to point 5 in your rotation and then you go back to point 1. Is it entertaining? Does it flow well? Does it keep you engaged? Does it feel challenging to pull off but rewarding if you do? Is it extremely rigid? Do you have no other options to do something and you're forced to do something? Like you have to use Festering Strike to build Festering Wounds and you have to use Score Strike to blow them up? Or maybe you can choose between Lightning Bolt or Lava Burst or Frost Shock to generate Maelstrom. Are you fixed in certain options like consuming your Soul Shards with a Chaos Bolt? Or can you choose between Slice and Dice, Rupture or Eviscerate? These are all things that are going to compound together to form the gameplay loop of your spec. The other point is the compulsion loop. Compulsion loop is essentially how enjoyable and entertaining something is, which is what is going to lead you to do it again, to repeat it. Is what's going to give you the nice feeling of doing it multiple times rather than saying, what is this shit? This is boring, I quit. The compulsion loop is how nice does it feel to build up towards something, reaching it, doing it, and feeling good because you did it. Having a well-executed Shadowlands window on a sub-rogue, a good combustion window as a fire mage, constantly getting a good flow of builder, spender, soul shards with your Chaos Bolt finishers as a destruction warlock. All those things are very good and very powerful compulsion loops towards making you feel that the spec plays nice. I'm gonna put that together to the gameplay loop and see how all of these specs compare to each other. Let's start with the first one, which is Subtlety Rogue. I'm starting with Sub-Rogue because Sub-Rogue has the quintessentially good compulsion loop. When you look at its gameplay loop, it seems rather simple. You build combo points with Backstab or Shadow Strike, you spend them with Eviscerate and Rupture, while making sure you're keeping up Slice and Dice buff on yourself. It seems rather straightforward. The spec though gets completely terrorized, it becomes completely at the mercy of Shadowlands. Shadowlands is going to force you to essentially change your entire loop. You have to now start looking at the cooldown and duration of your Slice and Dice, of your Rupture, the availability of Symbols of Death, maybe even secret techniques, maybe even your Covenant ability, and try to make them fit within your Shadowlands window. It creates this very smooth up and down rotation where you wait for Shadowlands, you pull off your Shadowlands, and then you wait again. It is smooth, it flows really well, it works for both single target and AoE, it doesn't change. It changed the ability will, some of them, but the flow is gonna stay the same. And when it comes to the compulsion loop, it works and goes exactly hand in hand with your rotation. The positive feedback and the satisfaction in playing sub with this type of compulsion loop is that you're gonna be having a build-up, your anticipation part, where you're building up your combo points, you're starting to pull your energy, you have correctly lined up the cooldown of Symbols of Death, the refresh of Slice and Dice, of Rupture, etc, etc. Now you start with your action, you enter Shadowlands, you do your full rotation, it poses good challenge to you, it is going to be satisfying and rewarding to pull it off properly, and then you're gonna have the reward, the big DPS, the massive DPS you did in the Shadowlands window. You will be waiting some 20-30 seconds before you can do it again, rinse and repeat. The two loops of Subtlety, the gameplay one and the compulsion one, are exactly going hand in hand, and they go very well together. They both flow very well, they are very smooth, it is satisfying to play and rewarding, so for these reasons, Subtlety goes in S tier. We're starting right off the bat with an S tier, and because we started with an S tier, this means that Survival is next. Survival has shown up anyways for this test examination, but they already know they're gonna flank this class. So here's a spoiler, they are in D tier. Survival gameplay loop revolves around Kill Command to generate focus outside of their normal generation, Wildfire Bomb, which is supposed to be their crowning jewel, and then Mungus Bite and Serpent Sting for their continued focus spending abilities, and Carve for AoE. The problem of this core rotation are the fact that Carve has a 6-second cooldown, Wildfire Bomb has an 18-second cooldown, which means you're left with just 3 abilities, Kill Command, Mungus Bite, and Serpent Sting. And Kill Command also has a 6-second cooldown. This is a tragic outlook on the way the spec works, even completely ignoring the existence of Raptor Strike and assuming Mungus Bite is the default, and that Wildfire Bomb is being played with Guerrilla Tactics and Wildfire Infusion to give you what should be the basic rotation of your spec. Wildfire Infusion changing your bombs into different types. Shrapnel Bomb allowing you to have a bleed, especially a AoE cleave when you use Carve, spreading it around, or Pheromone Bomb to make you spam Kill Command, or Volatile Bomb to make you do extra AoE damage to targets tagged by Serpent Sting. Each and every one of these bits makes you change the way your rotation is supposed to be played. However, it's just not enough. It's not enough because the cooldown of Wildfire Bomb is just too much. Even when Carve reduces the cooldown by 5, it's still just too long. Whenever you don't have your bombs, it feels like you are in a wheelchair. It just doesn't feel nice at all. On top of that, the rotation has this obsession on making kill command resettable, as if it feels nice to constantly spam kill command. It's just a not very entertaining effect when it comes to the base rotation. When it comes to the compulsion loop, how satisfying is it to pull these things off? Are their abilities looking cool, sounding cool, feeling cool, nice to use, etc, etc? Their cooldown, you know, I put a lot of importance on how strong your cooldown or cooldowns are in how the spec can feel. The cooldown of survival is really poor. Coordinated assault, while strong in and of itself, doesn't change much of what you do. It's not an infernal, it's not a combustion, it's not a blade storm, it's rather poor. When it comes to their abilities, Serpent Sting is terrible, not to mention the fact that you're supposed to be a melee user. Using Serpent Sting doesn't feel nice at all. Carve doesn't feel nice either, because of the very little damage and very little targets you hit. It just feels poor. Kill command is okay, because after all, kill command feels nice and sounds nice and is cool to use as a BM hunter, and even then he still loses some points as a survival hunter, because you know it's not going to be as strong as when a BM hunter uses it. It feels like you're using the sloppy seconds of BM hunter when you use kill command as a survival, and the only real focus points are Mongoose Bite and Wildfire Bomb. It feels nice to set up your focus and to set up your cooldowns to be able to stack Mongoose Bite up and do a lot of damage in single target, and it feels nice to have prepared properly to the different damage types of Wildfire Bomb and make them work. However, that is not nearly enough. It's not nearly enough for the spec, so to me they stay in D tier. As I mentioned before, they feel like a lost spec to me. And who's that guy sitting down ready to take the exam? White human male, Deus vaulting, crusading, tier 2 wearing, crusader title sporting, high lord charger mounting. Okay, I get it. It's a Retribution Paladin. You guys always very varied with your setup. Lots of fantasy. So Retribution Paladin, as I mentioned with Sub Rogue, being very centered around the cooldown, Retribution Paladin is sort of the wrong way to do it. Because Retribution Paladin draws way too many resources away from their basic rotation to have a massive payoff within the cooldown window. When you are so centered around a single cooldown, Avenging Wrath, you're gonna start to center your talents and your legendaries around that cooldown. You will start to be taking Final Reckoning, Seraphim, Execution Sentence, just to power up your cooldown window even more, starving everything else. The compulsion loop of Retribution Paladin is essentially too stretched up. The big DPS is there and is certainly bigger than Sub Rogue. The problem is that the build up is too long. The space between the action and the reward windows of Retribution Paladin and the anticipation, the build up, the all my cooldowns are down, now I have to wait, it's just too long. It's just too stretched. This wouldn't be a problem if their known cooldown window would still be rather enjoyable and would be rather effective at what they're supposed to do, which is damage. Like, as I mentioned already in the range DPS video, like Destruction Warlock still works very nicely outside of their burst windows, but Rat just doesn't. They are on a wheelchair. Sorry to twist the knife on your mobility guys, but that's what they have right now. To me, they are sitting on B tier. They are a little bit overcompensating when it comes to being cooldown focused. I think it does hurt them when it comes to enjoyability, feeling that you are way too useless outside of your cooldowns, but the big cooldowns are pretty big payoffs, so I think they can still manage to be rather enjoyable. And yeah, the usual Deus Vult, Crusade, blah blah blah. You guys keep LARPing. I don't know why. Everyone's fucking doing the same thing with Red Paladin. The same way I did in the Melee DPS video for Mythic Plus. After going Subtlety, I had to tone down Rogue spirits a bit by going for Assassination, so I'll do the same here and go over Assassination Rogue. Assassination's gameplay loop is shockingly similar to Subtlety. They have to build combo points and then spend them. They build them with Mutilate and Garrote, and they spend them with keeping up the buff Slice and Dice, keeping up the debuff Rupture, and then using Envenom. The difference between Assassination and Subtlety is that Subtlety has a very stable and recurrent cooldown window. Every 30-40 seconds they can go into Shadowlands, even earlier than that, whereas Assassination doesn't really have that. Assassination feels like they are a spec that is stuck. When I mentioned the compulsion loop, as I mentioned multiple times already, they lack the last part. They lack the reward. They lack the big DPS. They have the anticipation and they have the action. They have the starting up their DOTs, refreshing their DOTs and their buff on themselves with Slice and Dice, but then effectively the only finisher action they have that gives them payoff is Envenom, and that is just not enough. They need some other sort of burst cooldown or another ability that can give them any sort of payoff outside of Vendetta. And even then, reason why they were low in the Mythic Plus rating, Vendetta is still just single target, so in any AoE situation that's even gonna be weaker and feel like it's a less of a payoff. And on top of all of this, Vendetta still is just a 30% damage boost and 60 energy regen over 3 seconds. It does not drastically change the way you play. like Combustion, or like, of course, Shadowlands. So to me, the base gameplay loop of Assassination is already weaker than Subtlety, and then their Compulsion loop is also weaker. The payoff, the positive reinforcement and the positive feedback they have for finishing their rotation and starting again is just weaker. They lack a stronger cooldown, they lack something that gives them a bigger payoff outside of just having Envenom when they have full combo points, or being able to do it within Vendetta. To me, right now, that's just a little bit too weak. So they sit in C tier. And now we have Unholy DK. When you look at Unholy DK, you are kind of underwhelmed at their core baseline, at their core gameplay loop. Their loop is use Festering Strike to apply Festering Wounds and blow up Festering Wounds with Scourge Strike. This is 2 buttons. Expend your generated runic power with Death Coil for single target and Epidemic for multi-targets. You put down Death and Decay every 30 seconds, so your Scourge Strike can hit multiple enemies, and you use Outbreak to spread your Virulent Plague. This is extremely baseline, it's very basic. Effectively, in its concentrated core, it's 3 buttons. 1 to build Festering Wounds, 1 to expend Festering Wounds, and 1 to expend Runic Power. 1 for either the AoE button or the single target button. It is very, very baseline. Unholy DK is going to end up in the B tier. So, how do they end up in the B tier with this type of rotation? Well, first off, their rotation is less strict and constrained. They don't work on a combo point system or an energy system. They both have runes, and at the same time they have runic power. So sometimes they have to use Festering Strike, sometimes they have to use Festering Wounds, other times they have to spend the runic powers, other times they have to go back to spend runes. So it is a little bit more varied, but what really changes the rating to be a decent one is going to be the compulsion loop around their cooldowns. The anticipation, action and reward cycle of the Unholy DK cooldowns is pretty solid. Unholy Assault, Apocalypse and Dark Transformation are a very nice and concise set of cooldowns for them to use. They feel nice and rewarding to play. You have a nice anticipation where you want to make sure you can put down Death and Decay, especially in AoE situations. You have to make sure you have saved up on your runes or your Scourge Strike, you have some runic power, and then you can get over with your cooldowns. You have a big window and it feels nice. And the loop of this positive feedback, this positive loop that felt rewarding and satisfying to play, is what is going to push you to want to do it again, playing as Unholy. The reason why they can't rise above B is, despite the very nice loop when it comes to the cooldown session, the part outside of the cooldowns, the part without cooldowns, is similar to a spec they find themselves in the same tier with, Retribution. They are pretty empty outside of their cooldown windows, so it becomes a little bit more boring having to wait for your next round of cooldowns. They don't have anything outside of their cooldown windows that has a nice feeling to even just use. You could say, for example, Chaos Bolt feels really nice to use, even if you're not in a cooldown session. Even the sound effect, the animation and the hit of Lava Burst, it's nice to use. But Unholy doesn't have that. They are locked into very few abilities, and the only way to elevate the rotation is going to be with a use of cooldowns. So for me, Unholy sits in B tier. So now we are done with the first part of the Melee DPS rating on their enjoyment factor. There is 5 done and 8 left to go. Those videos are gonna come up soon, together with the videos for the range DPS. So tell me guys in the comments, how would you have rated these 5 specs, as well as predictions. Now that you know my criteria and my metric for rating the specs, what are the predictions for the remaining Melee DPS specs and their ratings? So, curious to see what you guys come up with, and see you guys soon.